All right, Rav. So we, over the last, oops, I'm on. I know, I'm making a fool of myself, but that's okay, because nobody watches this thing. Arr. We, over the last couple of weeks, spoke about Spain, about the Golden Age of Spain, and we got right up to the build-up to the expulsion, right? So I'm going to stop before the good part, right? That's what all good, right? Stop, collaborate and listen, right? No. I'm going to stop right before the good part, roll back to Ashkenaz, because what I really want to do is, remember, we have about, I think, 4 sessions left, and what I want to do is get us to the point where we can understand the difference between the tragedy that strikes Spain and the transformation that strikes Ashkenazi Jewry. I mean, there's tragic elements to both and transformation to both, but I'm going to characterize them as such because Spain will be no more, though Sephardic culture will spread throughout the Mediterranean and East, but Ashkenaz will live on until the Holocaust.
Sorry, can we just zoom up a little bit? When did Ashkenaz and Spain
split?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to speak about today. But just a reminder, we posited the true beginning of Spanish Jewry with the rise of the Caliphate of Cordoba, which is in the 10th century. Right, once Al-Andalus, there was an independent Muslim kingdom in Spain, the Jews began very quickly to integrate themselves into the political and social environment, and therefore gained very strong economic and religious structures, and that's when like Spanish Jewry really began. We tagged like the Golden Age of Spain in the 10th, 11th century, and Spanish culture will go on until the expulsion in 1492, and even then it will just be exported. Ashkenaz, well, we're going to speak about it today. So we left off our story of Europe with feudalism. If you guys recall, feudalism really, in a sense, is a land-based system for maintaining power relationships. That's what it is. Think lord, vassal, fief. Right? The lord is the person to whom the vassal swears fealty. In return for the sworn fealty of the vassal, the lord generally grants land, although you should know it's not always land-based. It could be other things. It could be trade concessions, it could be a tax farm, it could be hunting, fishing rights, etc. But the classic model is land. And there's a relationship of mutual obligation. The lord swears to protect the vassal. The vassal swears to raise a certain number of troops in general. It was a military, it was probably the first military, not really industrial, military economic complex, because it wasn't an industrial society, it was an agricultural society. The king in Europe at this point, if you recall that the breakup of the Western Roman Empire was supplanted by the rise of the heroic model of the German tribal states, which eventually basically concentrated themselves into proto-nations with kings. We're going to go through that whole process again, but that was more of the German model of divine right monarchy, right? And so the king, classically, is the guy who has the most land and is able to muster the most force to make everybody think he's king. Because in old time in German culture, the king claimed descent from the gods. That was their pagan version, right? And in modern culture, they will claim divine right to monarchy, which is not, I mean, as a philosophy in the church, is not quite so well developed yet at this stage of feudalism, but nevertheless, king and God are going to go together, and we're going to talk in a second about the role that the church plays in reinforcing monarchy. So the dynamic in feudalism is always between the king and the nobles. Because on one hand, the king grants the nobles lands, and when I talk about lands, a count, of course, has a county. That's where the language comes from, a duke and a duchy and all these things. But you could be talking about places that are the size of small countries. And what happens is they have the right to tax, take the produce, punish the serfs and all that within whatever land has been conceded to them. Their obligation to their lord is that when their lord goes to battle or is threatened, they muster a certain amount of troops.
So a duke will be under a lord, or a count under a lord?
Yes, thank you. A lord is a catch-all term for the person in the position of power in the relationship. So, like, the king could be the lord of a duke could be the lord of a count. I don't know. And the feudal system was not created whole cloth. So it's not like there was some very nicely worked out system that everybody fit into. It emerged, and eventually, with the creation of chivalry and coats of arms and etc., there's a lot of work done on who goes first.
And then did you not get to it, or are the serfs in this?
So we spoke about the serfs. I mean, just mention them briefly because I don't want to get too far back into it. I just wanted to remind everyone of a couple of things. But the serfs are basically, they're not slaves because their bodies are not owned by their masters. Right? You cannot buy and sell a serf. They can also, most importantly for this period of time, they can enter into independent contractual obligations, right? And so that's what differentiates them really from slaves, because though you can't buy and sell the body of a serf, when the land is bought or sold, the serfs go with it. So they are legally bound to the land. We talked about the emergence of how that emerged from the breakdown of the Western Roman Empire. I don't want to go there now. But the serfs basically are bound to the land. The critical piece that I want to point out is that in the period we're going to speak about, which is the period of the emergence of Ashkenazi Jewry, you're going to see a shift in feudalism from land as, how did I write it? 1 second. Granted privilege, not just land, but all these other aspects, to inheritable right. Now, what does that matter to us? Is that when land was a granted privilege, then he who grants it holds all the power in the equation. As soon as it becomes a heritable right? Now we enter into a completely different dynamic between king and nobles, because the nobles technically are obligated to muster troops to protect the king's rights, etc. But when they hand on the land to their children, it becomes more and more, or what's called less and less usufruct, just the rights to the benefits of the land, and more private property. And for those Marxist scholars out there, this is where Marx pegs the emergence of private property. Private property emerges as feudalism progresses from being truly a charismatic leadership, vassal-lord relationship where the land is simply the means of the lord to maintain his vassals, to the heritable right where the vassals suddenly say, okay, it's true, you're my lord, and we have a contractual obligation, but this land is mine. I can give it to my kids. Right? You can't just take it away from me. And the birth of private property in there is quite important, because we take private property for granted, but in no way is it an intrinsic aspect of human existence. And in fact, for most of history, has been, let's just say, sporadic at best. And of course, there was private property in the Roman Empire. It's not like it was invented here, but I'm just pointing out to you that it faded and had a reemergence, and this is where Marx pegs the emergence of the truly feudal system producing private property. Then, just to finish the thought, right, that capitalism is all about, once the industrial base starts to replace the agricultural base, is the concentration of those means of production into the hands of private property, because the hands of private property were just waiting to receive them. Okay, why does that matter for us? Because the Jews are going to play a very important role in that process, but we're going to get to what that role is in a minute. So as this is going on, you could say that feudalism is really from the 9th until the 15th, maybe the 16th. I mean, there are aspects of feudalism that you could probably peg today still. But the classic feudal era is about from the 9th to the 15th century, right? And in the beginning of that is going to be Charlemagne. He's crowned, right? If you remember Charles Martel, who stopped the Muslim advance in 732 in the Pyrenees, right? The various Merovingian and Carolingian empires, and we're not going to go into the breakdowns of the early Western Roman empires. What's important for us, however, Charlemagne, which is a name that many people have heard, he gives birth to the notion of the Holy Roman Empire. A new emergence of the claiming of the mantle of Rome. And what's important is who crowns Charlemagne king? The Pope. And in 800, the Pope emerges in Europe as the kingmaker. The Pope is the only trans-boundary power that Europe knows in his day. Which Pope crowned him? That's a good question that I should know, but I don't. Charlemagne, 800. Which Pope crowned him? Right? What's happening now is I pointed out to you that Gregory, in the end of the 6th century, early 7th century, managed to convert Pope Leo III. Managed to convert the Visigoths and the other Western European tribes from the Arian variant Christianity to the Catholic variant, which, aside from the theology, what it really means is that the Pope solidified his power base, because now he holds the keys, so to speak, literally, and the role that sacraments play in this, and we just don't have time to think about. But don't undervalue the power of Christianity in its propagating early Christianity. Well, this isn't early Christianity, medieval Christianity. It is propagating a theology that said that its priests hold the keys to salvation. Right? If you die without extreme unction, or if you're not able to take communion, or you can't confess your sins, right? You're stuck theologically stuck in many ways. And of course, classically, this went hand in hand with some rather graphic details of what happened to the sinner when they died stuck, right? And like, though some of us may scoff at such things, or may wake up in the middle of the night sweating, wondering what's going to happen to us when we die, right? The power of imagination in the medieval period, I will argue, was far more visceral than it is today, because they lived in a world that when it got dark, things came out of the forest to eat you, right? And you didn't go outside the castle a lot of the time because you were afraid. And fear plays a very powerful role at the edges of the medieval mentality. And the Jew, again, is a mystery. He's part of that mystery. So in 800, Charlemagne's crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III. And he begins a process of the reawakening of the aspiration to empire and to Christian empire. Now, we're going to see this process reach its culmination in the First Crusade in another 300 years. 1095, the First Crusade is declared. But before we get to the First Crusade, because we're Jews and we're actually interested in Jewish consciousness, there's at least two things we need to touch. First of all, in the year 1000, somebody asked, when did Ashkenazi Jewry begin? You asked. So if we're going to say Spanish Jewry began to differentiate itself, of course, from what? From just Am Yisrael. And what was the center of Am Yisrael at this point? Who were the leaders? The Gaonim, and therefore it was centered in Bavel. And we point out the Gaonic period really comes to an age, I mean, technically it ends a little bit later, but we'll peg it with Rav Hai Gaon dies in 1038. And though there was, I think, there were one or two Gaonim after him, he really was the last. He was the classic sunset effect, by the way, meaning the end of the Gaonic period in many ways was its most impressive. It wasn't something that just like petered out. It was like Rav Shrer and Rav Hai were incredible leaders, the prolific writers, thinkers, you know, their Piskei Halacha were formative, and then kind of that's it. And there were various reasons I don't want to go into, even socioeconomic, and why the invasion of the Seleucid Turks and all the stuff that was happening over there in the east, so we just can't talk about it. But that quite came to an end. Spain arose through the process we already discussed. And how did Ashkenaz? Now, Ashkenaz, as we pointed out, was constantly the recipient of shluchim, that the Gaonim were sending messengers, right, to teach, to strengthen Torah, to raise money, to support Tzurim Pampedita. So therefore, Ashkenazi culture was directly nursing from the Gaonic culture, as opposed to Spain, which, of course, they also had the access, but Spain very quickly, already in the beginning of the 10th century, was generating its own culture, right? So it took until the year 1000 until we see Ashkenaz, at least in a famous personality, beginning to generate its own culture, and that's Rabbeinu Gershom Meor HaGola, right, the light of the exile. In the year 1000, he calls a synod of Ashkenazi Jewry. Ashkenazi Jewry at this point was actually in Ashkenaz, which is the Rhine Valley. Here's the primary location. We're going to talk about the way in which they got there, basically crossing the Alps from Italy. And that's the origins, largely, of modern-day Ashkenazi Jewry. There are other elements that were left over from the Western Roman Empire. Well, we're going to talk about the fact that during this period of time, the Jews are actually the ones that maintained the trade routes that were left from the Western Roman Empire. Because the average European, if you ask them, didn't speak any else and didn't know where to go. Don't forget, it's so hard. Historical anachronism. It's so hard that if you would ask the average European, where are you? I'll say it in reverse. If I asked you right now, all right, where are you right now? So we could go through a process. I'm in the Beit Midrash. Where's that? I'm in Jerusalem. You know, where's that? Right? Yoshua's like pushing Google Maps, so he's just going to go expanding out so you can find where you are in the Milky Way. You know, exactly. Such a conception did not exist. Such a conception did not exist. The boundaries of your experience, your horizon, was extremely narrow for most people, and what was beyond it was very dark. Hence the fact that maps in this era had a tendency to draw like Larby dragons, right? You know, have the edges of known thought. That's why the Enlightenment, by the way, we won't get there together, but I'll just do a plug now that the plan is to actually teach next year from the Gaonim through modern, because I feel like modern Israeli history needs a proper treatment right now more than ever. I've done it before, I'm willing to do it again. So we're going to go from the Gaonim through the present, and we will speak next year about the fact that the Enlightenment in many ways is a lifting of the horizons of thought. That's what it was. Just like suddenly like, wow, I can see, you know? So in this era, they couldn't. And so, but the Jews were the inheritors of a history and a culture that if you said to a Jew in Ashkenaz, how do you get to Baghdad? First of all, he knows there's a place called Baghdad. He knows that it is at the other side of the Mediterranean, which he's familiar with as a ocean, or as inland sea, whatever you want to call the Mediterranean, doesn't matter, right? And many of them knew the way. And imagine what it was like when a Jew would pack up, a bunch of spices there in Baghdad on his donkey and just start to walk into the hills. Because he knows you gotta get to this place, you're gonna go there, and say, we'll get to it in a minute. But Rabbeinu Gershom Meor Gola calls together the leadership of Ashkenazi Jewry. And by the way, it's a bit of a tautology because by calling together these people, he de facto makes them the leadership of Ashkenazi Jewry. Meaning, you always got to be careful of post facto historic designations. Did they call themselves Ashkenazi Jewry? Maybe. Don't know. At this point, you'd have to do more work than I've done in the Piskei Halacha to see the language that they were using to describe themselves. But they were speaking Middle German, mixed with Hebrew. It was not yet what we would call Yiddish, because Yiddish really was created 2 centuries later when they left Ashkenaz and took German with them. But
beforehand they were speaking Hebrew?
no, I mean, like as we've spoken about many times, Hebrew is an adaptive language because its vocabulary is oriented toward the holy. So therefore, to speak about things like microwaves or even horse-drawn wagons, you start having to either create new words or adapt from the local languages. That's why we've seen this process many times. So the language of prayer and study was always Hebrew. It's possible within homes it was being spoken. And correspondence, absolutely, because of course if a Jew in Germany wanted to write to a Jew in Baghdad, or the one in Baghdad was speaking Arabic, that's a certainty, because in the Arab-speaking world, they adopted language like that. And they didn't have a common language other than Hebrew. That question is actually a very important, very deep question that I have not done adequate work on to tell you exactly what they were speaking. But he calls them together, and he makes, of course, what is famously known as Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom. It got 4 pieces. I want to use those 4 pieces to just unfold a little bit the culture of the time. But I do have a goal today. Number 1, the most well-known portion of it is he forbids polygamy, right? And he himself saw this as a product. So he saw polygamy as a cause of tremendous strife within families, as he records in his tshuva, and therefore he banned polygamy from the Jewish people within his purview. Now, there's a big discussion, for instance, amongst the Sephardic community to the beginning of the state, which they weren't really Sephardic at that point. They were Edot Mizrach. They were people who had lived in North Africa and what we call the Near East, but who had inherited Sephardic culture, which we'll speak about when we talk about the expulsion. Polygamy was still practiced until people came here in the 50s from Morocco, because in the Arab world, of course, polygamy is totally acceptable. Whether it's a good idea or not is a different question, but it's legal and socially acceptable. And of course, halachically, it's also legal. And well, you can ask the question whether it's socially acceptable, because you can start reading in the Tanakh, and you can get different takes on it. But Rabbeinu Gershom had 2 influences. First is his explicit one, which is it's just causing, when you're dealing with laws of inheritance, or my kids from this one and my kids from that one, and I tell you the story I always tell, that I was in an interfaith meeting once with Muslims and Jews, and there was a Viennese woman who had converted to Islam. And her aspiration was to become a second wife, because she didn't feel like she had she was not so young, and etc. So she was looking, and she was praising the fact that the Prophet had taken this many wives there. And this secular Arab guy looks at her, and this is all in Hebrew because it was only shared language. He says, you'll tell me, got plenty of friends who have more than one wife. He said they're just eating their fingers. He says, why? Because it's like this one said about that one, and you love her more than me, and this one's kids, and that. So essentially, you can get the impression that Rabbeinu Gershom wanted to solidify the family unit, number 1. Number 2, of course, the surrounding culture, polygamy was totally unacceptable. Now, how much of an influence that had on him directly or indirectly is like classic, revisionist history.
The story told about him that he was burned by a second wife.
Or there is a story told of him that indeed he himself had a problem with the children of the second wife. He had a lot of tsaras. We're going to get to his kids in a second. So that was number 1, prohibition of polygamy. Number 2, which was a necessary corollary of the first, was he is the one who created the necessity of obtaining consent from both parties to a divorce. Classically Jewish law, a man is able to divorce a woman against her will. Now she has to receive the get. She has to have a yad, But that's why the Gemara in Gittin is all full of these stories about, like, jump shots into the handbasket, and just throw it into her courtyard, and like the drive-by into her hat and all these things. Like, it's really, because she's just got to actually receive it. She doesn't have to agree. So Rabbeinu Gershon changed that. That if a woman refuses divorce, right, the man cannot,
She's not divorced.
she is not divorced, and therefore the man is still married. This is often missed in a lot of the social polemic around agunot in our day, that women are chained to men, but it also happens that men get chained to women. The difference is that the social context, men are much more easily, not only that, but they can just much more easily move to another place and start a different life, meaning it's just harder for women to do that. And number one. Number two, there is built into the Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershon what's called the Heter Mei Rabbanan. That I don't know if it's built in or if it was a post facto addition, but that there is an institution that if someone needs, I'll tell you just another story. A friend of my wife's got married on the same day we did, and they tried, the Chabad couple, they tried for years and years and years to have kids, nothing. Finally, through fertility treatments, she became pregnant with triplets. She gave birth in triplets. During birth, there was a complication, massive hemorrhaging. They saved her life, but she became a vegetable. So her husband, at a certain point, after about a year or two, wanted a wife. I mean, he's got triplets, and a wife that is completely non-communicative. I mean, not just like unable to help. And so therefore, but he's still married. And by the way, she can't, even in this case, consent is not an issue. She can't actually receive a get. She has no yad. Stuck. So the Heter Mei Rabbanan is, as far as I understand it, not a heter here to divorce her, because technically he can't. Even if she were willing to agree, she can't receive the get. It's a heter for him to marry a second wife, which is actually what he did. But you have to actually get 100 rabbis who are willing to hear the case and sign the document. That's why I call it Heter Mei Rabbanan. So such a thing exists. And again, so the status of a man and the status of a woman in marriage shifts, but not entirely. But this, again, as we know, the more a woman's status is protected in marriage, the more socially she is able to fight for the other rights and privileges that she wants within the family and society. So this is a very big step in that direction. Number three, he created greater leniency in the rules of accepting people who have been forcibly converted back into the fold. He had a son who, it's not so clear whether he was forcibly converted. His son was an apostate. In the story is that he sat shiva for his son for 2 weeks, one for his physical death and one for his spiritual death. And this is one of the earliest references we have to what was actually a very long-standing Ashkenaz tradition, that when someone converted out of Judaism, they would sit shiva and he was gone. Right? And that's not just like some old movie thing that you guys might have seen. People really did that because there was, and as we'll speak about, one of the tremendous challenges of Jewish life in Europe, as it was in Spain, was not just the brutality and what's called the lachrymose version of Jewish history, which is that we all just suffered and it was terrible. There was also tremendous attraction in Christian culture and tremendous intimacy of interaction. So therefore, when people gave into that attraction, they were considered dead. And we'll see that role of death is very important. Death is unfortunately going to play a very big role in our story today. Okay, the fourth piece was you're not allowed to open mail addressed to another person. Right, it sounds somewhat, mundane. You can't open mail addressed to another person. It sounds somewhat mundane, but this is the first time such a law was promulgated, at least halachically. And from what we see from this is the importance that the role of commerce was playing in Am Yisrael. Why? Bills of exchange. We mentioned it before. A great term, if you're like into terms that you want to look up later, the Radhanites. Radhanites, Radhanites, medieval Jewish merchants, right? Basically, between 500 and 1,000, they were the ones who kept the Western Roman, former Western Roman Empire connected to the trade routes to the east, right? And how would you do such a thing? Because if you wanted to go from the Rhineland to buy spices somewhere in Eretz Yisrael, you want to get to Aza, which was the port at which the spice route ends from the east. So if you're going to put 1,000 golden ducats on your donkey and start riding off into the woods, as we've spoken about before, what's going to happen to you as soon as you get out of town? Yeah, you're lucky if you lose them, right? But if you go to a local Jew who happens to have a cousin in Baghdad, and you give him 1,000 golden ducats, and he gives you a letter and says, my friend Shlomi just gave me, it's called a bill of exchange, right? My friend Shlomi just gave me 1,000 golden coins, and when you receive this letter, give him, or less usually, give him the equivalent, or because it might also be an investment. He goes and comes back and sells it, and that, right? It's amazing, because then, if a bunch of scary, feudal goyim jump you in the woods there, all they've got is a piece of paper. Mm-hmm.
How did they ever transfer the money to the cousins? Why would...
As long as that system keeps going, it works just fine. Because you keep tabs. And banking houses, later, when the Italian banking world gets off the ground, the Jews will play a very significant role.
And we're still in the 11th century?
We're still in the 11th century. So this is before the rise of the Italian city-states, and that was before the Crusade. Right, before the Templars, before the Crusade. This is why I'm telling you this, is that before the Crusade, it was actually largely Jewish merchants who kept, and forget the actual commerce, that's like small potatoes. They kept alive the knowledge. They had maps. There was recently a discovery in a cave in Afghanistan of a cache of 11th century manuscripts. You guys remember hearing about that? It was like in the last year or maybe even 2 years, right? And what they think it was actually a geniza for these people. Because of course they would travel the same routes and yeah, it was along the Silk Road, and Jews are going to carry scrolls. Either they're learning Torah or they're praying, or part of what they did was carry scrolls, right? And so just do not undervalue the importance of keeping knowledge alive, because as long as the knowledge of these trade routes was alive, then the commercial interests could either flourish or diminish, but the knowledge was there to allow them. Once that knowledge fails, you can have all the money you want. If you don't know how to get to China, you ain't bringing anything back, right? That's why Marco Polo was such an important person in European history. Yeah.
Is there any thought of who these traders were? Were they the Allies?
Oh, who they were culturally?
Within the Jewish tradition, were they?
I don't know, but I'll tell you this, at the risk of not sounding so frum. Not everybody was so frum once upon a time. No, because you just think about the challenge of what it would be to walk out of Ashkenaz and make it on foot, by boat, camel, caravan, and say kosher food, Shabbat, Hagim, lots of questions about family purity, the role of the sexual intimacy between Jews and non-Jews in European history gets a lot of ink spilled in revisionist Jewish history today. Revisionist Jewish history today is largely about trying to prove that there is no separate Jewish culture. Right? Meaning classical Jewish history is all about the fact that we were always the Jews and we didn't mingle with the Goyim. Revisionist Jewish history today is all about proving there was really no such thing as some intrinsic Jewish culture. It was just an amalgamation that adapted wherever it went. Right? As is generally true, it seems to me the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Right? But I've been spending a lot of time reading the revisionist side lately because I'm frum enough as it is. But anyway, why do I say that? Is because I don't know that the categories that we apply are really relevant. But what you can say for absolute certainty that these were people of bold spirit. It's going to take a lot of courage to just say, yeah, I'm pretty sure I know how to get to Baghdad from here. Gonna take me 3 months on foot, Right. So, but because that tends to also combine itself with a certain intellectual prowess. I mean, if you're bold and let's just call it what it is, you're bold and stupid, right? You don't generally get the idea to make a lot of money by silks and spices from Baghdad. You might be brought along to schlep. Right, but you're not going to be the guy driving the process. Okay, so Rabbeinu Gershom, aside from the very important halachic aspects of his cherem, this is really the birth of an independent Ashkenazi Jewry. What's our proof? Is that this is the year 1000. Rav Hai Gaon is still alive. So is Rav Shrera actually in 1000. He might have just died. He's got something to say. What should he do? He should write a letter to the Gaonim. The Gaonim should respond, and it should be something for Klal Yisrael. But he's dealing with a purely local group of people, and he makes something which is expressly only for Ashkenazi Jewry. It's rejected, and then there's a whole debate about how long it lasts for, and if, but nobody sees this as being obligatory upon all of world Jewry. And it's one of the first moves that we see of this breakup the Rambam describes in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah, that the transition between the Gaonim and the Rishonim, not that he uses those terms, right? The transition between the Gaonim and the Rishonim is the breakup of central authority. That what the Gaonim said was obligatory upon all of Am Yisrael. The Rishonim, no. They were local authorities. Now, what will happen is, well, I won't tell you what happened because I want to stay focused in my flow here. So that, how many? Probably, look, when we look at the numbers that were killed in the Crusades, it would make sense that there were tens of thousands. But that could be an over-exaggeration because numbers in tragedy tend to be pumped up in history. So, rolling forward, so that's 1,000. Rabbeinu Gershom makes his cherem. 1038, we said Rav Hai Gaon dies, and we're going to officially peg that as the end of the Gaonic period. Rashi establishes his yeshiva in Troyes in in France, somewhere over there, in 1065. Rashi is the student of the students of Rabbeinu Gershom. And for our purposes, the thing about Rashi, right, one of the reasons that they reworked the acronym Rashi, which is Reb Shlomo ben Yitzchaki, yeah, ben Yitzchak, to Rabban Shel Yisrael, right, the rabbi of all Israel, is because Rashi is really the Ashkenazi bridge. He's the mythic bridge in the sense that he takes the Chumash and embeds it in the thought of Chazal. I'm going to speak why I call it a mythic bridge in a second. And he's also a conceptual bridge in the sense that he actually is, without Rashi, we wouldn't be able to read the Gemara. And we're going to speak about what the Gemara is in Jewish consciousness after we talk about the Crusades. But I want you to understand the import of those two things. First of all, we'll leave the Gemara part alone, because we're going to talk, actually, when we talk about the Tosfos, I want to talk about what the Gemara becomes for Jewish culture. But what do I mean about embedding the Chumash in the thoughts of Chazal? We spoke about the birth of Christianity. I pointed out to you guys that in many ways, the struggle between Christianity and Judaism is a hermeneutic battle. It's a battle of meaning. Who is able to read this story accurately and tell it to the point where it can shape the future? Who's Esau? Who's Yaakov? Who's the older brother? Who's the younger brother? Right? Who did God choose? Who did God reject? Right? These are live. By the way, Ad Hayom Hazeh. Don't think that when the Pope comes here and speaks to us about his elder brother, right, that's a neutral statement. Because who's the older and who's the younger is a very important dynamic. You might think, oh, it's always good to be the elder brother, right? Except, of course, in the Chumash, there's not one elder brother that inherits. The primogenitor of the Chumash is Afuch. Actually, in the Tanakh, as far as I'm aware, not one of significance. I'm going to get into the particular pshatim between Catholicism and Judaism, but it's important to note, what? It's important to note that there is a battle of meaning based in text. And therefore, Rashi, taking the text and embedding it in the fullness of Chazal's thought, to the point where, of course, you guys may have had this experience, I don't know if in your own education, but certainly in speaking to other people, that I've seen it many times, particularly people growing up in the normative religious system, don't know the difference between Pshat and Drash. Right? They're like, what do you mean that story about Abraham breaking the idols is not in the Chumash? Right? Or like, other classic stories. And on one hand, there's a very big pushback against that today in education, where I was, you gotta know what the Pshat is, you gotta know what the Drash is. But that's not the way people thought in the Middle Ages at all. What we consider to be sort of scientific reality and mythic storytelling were not differentiated on that level. Arguably, they're really not anymore either, but we like to believe they are. There was not such aspiration. So therefore, Rashi seamlessly weaves Chazal's understanding into the Chumash and allows Am Yisrael to continue to tell a story that will let us survive. This is not a neutral thing. It's not like we're just like arguing on the street corner here, right? These are both literally polemic battles. There are a few classics that we're probably not going to get to today, but like the great debate between the Ramban and Pablo Cristiani. I think I wrote down the date of that for you guys. Yeah, in 1267. We'll get to it. right? But and there are others, and they happened in Christian Spain, and they happened elsewhere in Europe. Christian Spain was like really big on it, where a lot of high stakes. Bring me your smartest Jew, and I'll bring you our smartest priests, and we're going to duke it about who's right about God. And by the way, if the Jews win, right, winner takes all. And by the way, it's fairly much presupposed who's the winner because the power structure within which the debate was happening was a Christian power structure. So really, the only reason the Christians were willing to do it was an attempt to finally force the Jews to admit that they were wrong, thus leading to conversion, leading to a whole notion of eschatology, of the return of their Savior being bound up with the Jews recognizing their failure in the beginning. I'm only pointing this out to point out to the significance of Rashi embedding the text with Chazal has a social context, meaning there was a polemic going on. For another example of this, by the way, is chapter and verse. In the Tanakh as we have it, it's not clear to me when exactly that emerged, but chapter and verse in the Tanakh as we have it are a product of the monks of Europe. We adopted that system for convenience. First of all, it is a lot more convenient, right? Number one. Number two, for ease in polemical debate. Right? If you're going to cite chapter and verse and you're citing different things, you're not going to get very far. Everyone's like scrabbling for their Bible. That's not what it says in my Bible, right? So the impact was extreme, number one. Number two, it also is going to lend itself to the inward-focused consciousness of Am Yisrael, is that we cease to live in the same world as the European Jews. As the European non-Jews. To the point where in 16th century Poland, you'll have someone who, from all external parameters, is poor, oppressed, and burdened by society, et cetera, and looks at himself as the ghetto superstar chosen by God, who has absolute supremacy over the goyim that are around him. How can he maintain such an inner posture? A lot of it will have to do with the fact that when he reads the Bible, he hears the words of Chazal directing him to understand it, that his life now has meaning. It is expressive of the chosenness and belovedness of the Jewish people, despite its external difficulties. And this is something we're going to discuss more. But that was one of the major contributions that Rashi makes to Ashkenazi Jewry, and it's going to play itself out in the Crusades in a big way. So, in 1095, Pope Urban II proclaims the First Crusade. Now, I can't even begin to touch the reams of scholarship on the Crusades. Even the little bit that I've read, I can't even begin to process for you. But there are a few things that we need to know. Number one, it was avowedly with the purpose of restoring Christian control of the holy places in Jerusalem, right? It was indeed a crusade. Now, don't forget, however, as I pointed out 2 weeks ago, or however long it was, that the crusading spirit had already been born in the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, the Christians had been trying to push the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula already for about 100 years. So like that crusading spirit against the Muslims was not like born out of a desire to get to Jerusalem. It was born out of a desire to get rid of the Muslims, right? Number one. Number two, there's significant problems in the population density in Europe happening right now. The problem with primogenitor, the idea that the firstborn inherits the majority of your land and that you divide up the rest between the others, is you can just do the math. If I start with a big chunk of land and I give, 2/3 of it to my firstborn, and I cut up the last third between 4 other kids, and then each of them does the same thing, and each of them does the same thing, we're starting to get down to postage stamp size pretty quickly. And there's not a lot of space, right? And the idea of the knight errant, which plays a very significant role in early European literature, many people will argue is based on this idea of someone who was raised with the finest education they could have in their day, which was not so impressive, but right, primarily in war and certain aspects of culture, and has no place to be. And so if he goes wandering off looking for adventures, what is his hope? To rescue the damsel in despair and keep the castle, right? That's what he's after. He's looking for a place to be because there's less and less place to be in the feudal system for everyone except a very small segment. So the Crusades are very appealing on that point because exactly what they do is they send them off to the east and they create the kingdom of Akko, the kingdom of Jerusalem, the kingdom of up in Syria. I forget what it was called even. So there's another piece there. Aside from the desire to take control of the Christian holy places, there's a desire to carve out new space for feudal territory, right? Number 3, there is a call that is made by the Byzantine emperor, Alexios Komnenos, who is the head of Eastern Christian Orthodoxy. We didn't speak about it, but in 1054, there's what's known as the Great Schism, the actual official split between Eastern Orthodoxy in Rome, or just Orthodox Christianity in Rome. Actually, it's not just Eastern Orthodox; it's just Orthodox Christianity in Rome. Not classical Christianity, but as point out to you, despite that schism, when the Turkic tribes began to invade the Byzantine heartland from the northeast, they called for help. These were Muslim Turkic tribes, and they called for help, and it was yet another incentive for the Crusades. I'm not going to go into the details of the Crusades. There's a few things that we do need to know. First of all, if the birth of a consciousness of Christian Europe really happened in 732 in Tours when Charles Martel stopped the Muslim advance, and I pointed out to you like that was the birth of a consciousness of like, wow, we're Christian Europe and you're not, right? So then the Crusades basically amounts to the first foreign policy of Christian Europe, right? Then now the Pope has solidified his power enough and has enough influence over the political infrastructure that he can say, okay, this is where we're going. And there's a crazy history to European Christianity at this point with the Pope and the anti-Pope and all these things. I'm not going to get into it. Yeah, the anti-Pope. You can look it up. Yeah, it was not simple. Not simple. So in many ways, if this was the first act of foreign policy of Christian Europe, one of its primary impacts was the first step toward reopening international trade between the West and the East on a full scale. And of course, who loses out in that equation? The Jews. Because it used to be that the Jews were the only ones that were moving between Islam and Christianity. Now, once the Crusades establishes more than a beachhead, I mean, it's about 200 years from 1099 when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem to 1291 with the fall of the kingdom of Akko, which, by the way, if you guys have never gone up to Akko and seen the Crusader fortress up there, it's just like, you have to see it. If you want to get a sense of the scale that these guys are operating on. Also, like Belvoir, Kohavi Ardennes. Yeah, I mean, these are like, you really got to see it. Montfort is beautiful, but it's not as impressive because it's kind of like, just run down castle in the middle of nowhere, although if you think about where it is, it's pretty impressive. But Akko or Belvoir, like, you got to see it because you get a sense that these guys basically just rampaged their way across Europe and established a kingdom and meant to stay 200 years. Which is one of the reasons, by the way, that certain segments of the Muslim world here today likes to call us crusaders. Because they say, like, you guys did the same thing. You come from Europe. You conquer the land. You'll be gone in 200 years. So, first major step in reopening international trade. There was also, by the way, a very important religious element in this. Aside from like retaking the Holy Land from the infidel, there was a notion of plenary indulgence. Right? Indulgences have gotten a bad name. Indulgence has gotten a bad name in our day. Let's all go home and eat fudge. An indulgence is the remission of the temporal punishment, which in Catholic theology should come together with sin even after forgiveness has been granted. Meaning, the Crusader or a Catholic European did something real bad. I don't know, one of the 7 deadly sins you pick, right? He goes to the priest. He confesses his gluttony. The priest gives him absolution, but there's still a notion that there's no free lunch. I get it, gluttony, no free lunch. And so therefore there is still punishment in this world, which will give you, what do you call that in Jewish? Kapara. Right? I mean, we have the same notion that tshuva together with mita or yisurim, or like, look up in the Gemara, right? So it's not a foreign notion, but the idea of the indulgence is that you are, once you have admitted your sins, confessed, and taken care of the theological aspect, now you can actually get protection from the physical consequences of it in this world. So you can imagine in a European culture, which had been, if it had any media, so to speak, at the time, most of it had to deal with hellfire and what it was going to look like when the sinner burned, right? And furthermore, was constantly plagued, pun intended, by the miseries of medieval life, whether it was war, famine. We're not going to get to the Black Plague today, I can tell by the clock already, but the Black Plague was the largest in that scale, but don't think that people weren't dying by disease, right? So the fact that the Pope was willing to grant you plenary absolution from your physical suffering meant many people took the cross. That's what they called it. Called it taking the cross. They took a vow to free Jerusalem, and they began to move en masse toward the Holy Land. Now, there were two tiers in which this happened. One was the nobility, who were able to muster horses or even ships, right, and were far more organized in a military expedition. And then there was a mass social movement of poor, sometimes barefoot, hungry peasants who, of course, didn't pack lots of food for the 3-month walk to the Middle East. So, and therefore they what they call it foraging, right? They foraged on their way, or pillaging. And this is why, of course, it's worth it to say this today, because we are now actually in the week when Kehilot Shum were destroyed. I realized it this morning. It was in the lead up to Shavuot. And sadly, I don't know the year in the Jewish calendar. In the year 1096, that the mobs of the poor and desperate who decided to leave on the crusade reached the cities of Spires, Worms, and Mainz. Right? That's known as Shum, collectively, Shin, Vav, Mem. Right? And proceeded to come to the realization that why would they go all the way to the Far East to kill the infidel when the infidel existed in their midst? And according to the accounts written by the Jews of the day, began to forcibly convert and kill the Jews of these three communities, to the point where those three communities in particular ceased to be major Jewish communities ever again. Now, the question of what actually happened there is a very thorny question, because it touches not only on what actually happened, but it touches on the nature of what history is. Of what history is. Because one way we could know what happened there is to read the accounts, and there are, not firsthand, but there are relatively close-hand accounts written by Jews of what happened at the time, right? But they have a very clear agenda. They were written about 100 years later, and their agenda was to create a cult of martyrdom. And I don't think that that's a revision, even that's the way the revisionist historians call it. It's certainly not their chiddush, because of course that cult of martyrdom still exists today. In fact, those of you who were in shul on Shabbos participated in it. You know how? Av harachamim. Right after Kriyas Torah on Shabbos, when of course morning is Asr. Nevertheless, I don't know, Sephardim say it? No. I didn't think so. Nevertheless, I know some people say this, but I don't know how. I'm fully aware, even if Rosh Chodesh falls out, or when we do the Mevarchin Chodesh, we still say it anyway. So Avar Achamim, which talks about these kehilot that were swift as lions and mighty as, or swift as leopards and mighty as lions, or whatever the language is, to serve God by doing what? Dying. Serve God by dying. Right? It was a poem that was composed. People actually have attributed it to Rashi. As far as I can tell, it's not true. No, as far as I can tell, it's not true, because Rashi was earlier, because Rashi did witness the First Crusade, but died soon after. It's more likely just that's like the classic method in giving something important. It's called Tola Be'ilan Gadol, right? You just attribute something to somebody important. Lo Mishaneh is a product of institutionalized mourning for these communities that were destroyed. By the way, if you go further into this, another incident, which we spoke about actually in Elul, if you recall, right, shows up in your Yom Kippur Machzor, right? The story of the 10 martyrs, which of course is the martyrology of, by the end of the period of Bayit Sheni, even though of course the Bayit Sheni had already been destroyed, but that's a martyrology from late antiquity, worked its way into the Machzor and into the Tisha B'Av Seder around this time in European tradition, right? Because there was an attempt, and there's widespread. If you do the research, the martyrology poetry is very intense. It's a very intense poetry, by the way, extremely graphic, because a lot of the descriptions revolve around the fact that the Jews of Ashkenaz, rather than letting themselves, perhaps, God forbid, be forcibly converted, or even killed at the hands of non-Jews, killed their families and themselves. Now, it's unclear how widespread the phenomenon was, but what is clear is it certainly was happening. There's just too many detailed accounts for it to not have been true. The extent to which it was true, it's hard to know, right? But I'm talking about detailed descriptions of people saying a special shechita bracha before killing their children and then their wives, and then al kiddush Hashem, and then drawing lots right, between like the rabbi and the shochet and not the cantor, there was no cantors, the rabbi, the shochet, and the other important people of the community to kill each other until the last person would kill himself. And the enshrining of that willingness to spill their own blood in purity became a centerpiece in Ashkenazi culture. The smile goes out of Ashkenazi Jewry during the First Crusade. Functionally speaking, the morning that we celebrate, the morning that we mark, the morning that we participate in during Sfirat Omer, is of course rooted in the story of Rabbi Akiva and his students, and it's rooted in the nature of the Omer itself. But functionally speaking, for Ashkenazim, it really gets its historical supercharge from the Crusades. That's why it is a visceral mourning for those for whom it is, right? Because the Kilot Shum were destroyed in the days leading up to Shavuot, at the end of the Omer. So arguably one of the reasons that at least the Fia did and Ashkenazim are not Masik Avelos. You guys know this, that like Lag BaOmer comes, you cut your hair on Lag BaOmer, you do weddings on Lag BaOmer, but when Lag BaOmer passes, you go back to the mourning. Although it's not so widespread amongst the non-Haredi Ashkenazi world today in Israel. Sardim not. Sardim it's Masik. It's it. You're done. There are different hanhagas of what people do. But one of the major reasons for Ashkenazim is because the end of the Omer was the most tragic period in Ashkenazi history. The smile goes out of Ashkenazi history in the First Crusade. Right? Not only does the smile go out, but there is like I said, an enshrining of the martyr as a critical aspect of culture. Because what happens is it's cultivated as an ideal. Who are the ideal martyrs? Talmidei Chachamim, who are willing to die for Al Kiddush Hashem. What's the problem with people who are willing to die Al Kiddush Hashem? If everybody's willing to do it, what happens? There's no more Torah. So what happens is a creation of a cultural awareness of if they were willing to die for God, then I'm willing to live for God in an increasingly difficult situation, right? And so the cathartic nature, and by the way, I don't know if you guys have ever let yourself go into like the Asar Hargei Malchut, right? But if you like really let your go and notice it's quite graphic and it's got nothing, by the way, nothing compared to the classic Ashkenazi martyrology poetry, the blood sprayed on the paragod and the innocents who bared their throats to their fathers, and like it's really graphic poetry. It's also some of the Kinot Tisha B'Av are remnants of a much larger corpus of words, and of course they were Talmidei Chachamim who wrote most of it, and so therefore it's also deeply referential, and the imagery is very early Kabbalistic imagery. But I want to like really get you to understand, number one, that creation of a cult of martyrdom, not meaning everybody wants to be a martyr, but meaning that a martyr holds an ideal in society, is what allows them to solve the problems. They need people willing to die for the Torah. Because in Europe at this time, if you weren't willing to die for it, that's it, it's all over. But if everybody dies for the Torah, then there's no Torah left. So therefore, they use this as inspiration to willingness to live for it.
Because of the willingness to convert.
Because of the intent, and that's the other piece that thank you for pointing out that I'm getting to, is that, and don't think it was just because the Christians were so awful and evil and life was so bad. If the Christians were so awful and evil life was so bad, then it wouldn't have made a difference if there was some cult of martyrdom. When you have an external oppressive enemy, you don't really need to create an internal ideal of Mesirat Nefesh, because it's happening anyway, right? There was plenty of persecution, don't get me wrong. The real problem was how attractive Christian society was. Life was much easier if you were willing to convert, economically, socially, right? And not even just willing to convert. Like, it wasn't so hard and fast. Just mingling. Just mingling socially, mingling economically, mingling sexually. I'm reading a essay on Italian Jewry right now, and there's apparently an expression that Bart Nura, I don't know if he coined it, but he certainly made it prominent in the halakhic literature, that Italian Jews were strict on wine and lenient on water. Meaning on what? And apparently the strictures of stam yenam, of the wine made by non-Jews, even though they're not idolaters, they were extremely, extremely strict on. But many of the women apparently did not go to the mikvah. The widespread phenomenon of going to bathhouses. Bathhouses, which he reports, were actually co-ed. Right? And the big fights of the rabbis at the time were prevent Jewish women from going to bathhouses that were staffed by non-Jewish men. They'd given up on the men. Right? So, like, there's attraction in European culture which is not a threat to the individual, it's a threat to the collective. So therefore, if these holy martyrs were willing to sacrifice their children's lives with their own hands, and I'm sitting there on Yom Kippur or on Tisha B'Av or Av HaRachamim on Shabbos, weeping of the nobility of spirit of this ideal scholar, warrior who spills the blood of his own children, then how can I not do what his inheritors, the scholar leadership, are asking me to do? It's a very important role in the shaping of Ashkenazi culture. So there's another piece here, which it's fine. I plan to spend 2 days getting to this, but I want to end on this note. So everybody knows famously, of course, Rashi had no sons; he only had daughters, right? But his both biological and intellectual descendants are known collectively as the Tosfos, right? Because Rashi, of course, was not published as a commentary on the side of Gemara. It was published as like pamphlets. They're called the Kuntras in the language of Tosfos. The Tosfos took these Kuntrasim and wrote their own thoughts on them. What did the Tosfos reintroduce into the study of Torah, and why did it matter on a cultural level? Classically, you look in the academic literature, they reintroduced what's known as dialectic analysis. That sounds really fancy. There's 2 pieces you need to know. Number one, dialectic classically means it's a discourse between two or more people holding different points of view. And the idea is that the truth is reached by their reasoned argumentation, right? This wasn't a chiddush, of course. What does it mean? They were going back to what the Gemara did. And that was the whole point, is that after the age of the Amoraim, when the Gemara was just an organic product of the life they were living, right? It wasn't like, it was no like Gemara that they were studying. It was their life. The Gaonim related to the Gemara like in 2 different ways. First of all, the Gaonim were, of course, the continuation of that organic life, so the Gemara didn't seem something foreign to them. But their primary usage of it was what? Clarifying practical behavior, right? And a lot of the early Rishonim and like the Spanish, schools were very big into like practical halachic behavior. The Rif is probably the best example of this. It took the Tosfos to take Gemara to the level which we relate to it now, which is by returning to this dialectic, number one. Number two, the other aspect of dialectic is they treat the Gemara as a holistic document. What do I mean? It's that each thing needs to be considered in the context of everything. And so therefore, the plain meaning of the text becomes less decisive because you have to be able to see its wholeness. Now, what does this do?
True amongst the Amoraim and their understanding of like.
The Amoraim weren't relating to it as text. The Amoraim related to the Tanaitic statements that way. And so the Tosfos were not. It wasn't such a chidush what the Tosfos were doing, except in the sense of a renewal. Right? These 2 aspects were actually what the Amoraim were doing. They were relating to Tanaitic statements, each in the context of all, and of course it was dialectic because they were arguing, right? So the Tosfos, in a sense, really returned to that path. But the difference is that the Gemara was no longer an organic product of their life. And here's where my argument about language in Spain and Torah and Ashkenaz start to come together. This is where alien consciousness is born in Ashkenaz. That they step outside of the Gemara. It's no longer an organic product of the life that they're living, or solely the source for guidance in practical matters, but it becomes an object of study. Now, what's fascinating about that is as soon as it becomes a serious object of study, the socioeconomic institutionalization of its study and the ongoing allegiance to the halachic project of determining God's will in every action actually makes their lives an organic product of it. You follow me? For the Amoraim, the Gemara was a product of their lives. It was expressive of their lives. And for the Gaonim, they were kind of a continuation of that process. The only chiddush the Gaonim has, they started like leaning on it for practical advice. So guidance. The Tosfos stepped out of that and started saying, well, let's look at it as an object of study. We're not a product of it, except of course in their historical allegiance, but not practically speaking. They weren't some continuation of the Amoraim. They knew that, I believe, right? But what did they do is that they institutionalized a way of life of study, a socioeconomic way of life of study. The ideal of Torah study becomes the center of Ashkenazi Jewry. Ad hayom hazeh. One of the great gifts that the Haredi world has to bring to Am Yisrael is the fact that they've built a society that's not constructed on consumption. I mean, of course, we'll have to consume, and there's materialism everywhere. But they have built a society that is constructed on learning Torah. It is what a society could look like that is built on something else. And that begins really with the Tosfos. They really begin to build a life or built on study. And of course, they are deeply committed to the halachic project. What's the halachic project? I'm going to figure out what God wants me to do in every situation. As the world gets bigger and more complicated, what value decisions, what clarifications I make here. So what happens is that their lives become a product of the Gemara. Instead of the Gemara being a product of their lives, as it was for the Amoraim and even for the Gaonim, their lives now become a product of, this is exile, my friends. We are now living in the Gemara. The Gemara is not expressive of our national experience. Our national experience is expressive of the Gemara. We are inside the Gemara, floating through Europe. Of course, we're not isolated. That's why that whole cult of martyrdom is very important, right? Because, not everybody's turning to the Gemara. We're talking about the elite scholarly class. Nevertheless, it's the cultural core, right? And this is the same type of alien consciousness that when in Spain they stepped back and said, language as an abstract. Wow. Now let's think about what that means for learning the Torah. Because we're going to bring rules of language to revelation of God when God's going to be bound by rules. What does that mean? Right? The Tosfos is doing the same thing in the Gemara, which is like, step out, look at it from the outside. And the amazing thing is the project of looking at it from the outside actually causes their lives become a product of it. Right? And of course, classically, the Jews are what holds alien consciousness in Europe. They are the quintessential outsider. And it's a very important part, and I'll finish with this because I know I'm running over. It's a very important part of development. Pshat, we're going to leave untouched. That's part of our construct we've said. It's just the surface contact point. Remez is the embodiment within the text, right? I am wholly immersed in this text. This text and I are one. It's my story. As soon as I'm able to step outside and recognize that it's my story, instead of live it as such, then we're into drosh. Right? I'm going to tell you my story. Well, that means that you know it's a story, right? So like, are we in your story right now, or are you telling me your story, right? That level of alienation, of perspective, is powerful, gives you insight, allows for comparison and different levels of contemplation, dialectic, etc., holistic thinking, because you're not just immersed in the stream of it. The challenge that will come, and it's really the Mekubalim, and the Arizal in particular, is how do you re-immerse yourself in the story when you're aware that it's your story? Right? You're not going to be able to just be embodied in it anymore and go along in the flow. And you don't want to remain alienated from your story because, of course, then it can't give you the chiyut, the sustenance you need. How do you re-enter into it knowing that it's your story? And it will be the Arizal. Well, he was way behind. But by the way, don't miss the fact that literary criticism and many of the powerful critiques that they bring to the understanding of the use of language in telling a story, in my opinion, was preceded by the Tosfos by almost 1,000 years in their relationship to text, and what classically they call the contextualization of everything. Okay, so I think we'll stop there, and we'll pick up Ashkenaz all the way through the Black Plague next week. Stay tuned.